I'm here. The the film really emerged out of my historical perspective and anger at January 6th, at the kind of sense that these folks who stormed the Capitol, who were out to kill Nancy Pelosi, overturn a free and fair election, were wrapping themselves in the flag as if they were patriots, as if they were doing the work of democracy. And what I know as a historian, as someone who has lived through it, is that the work that African Americans have done in this nation has been to believe in a democracy that has not always believed in them, was to fight for a democracy that always would not fight for them, was to believe in the vision of what this nation could be, not exactly what it is. And it is that vision of what it could be that led me along this path to begin to tell the story about Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the only successful coup in US history, where a fusion government, a government where African Americans and whites were empowered together with a broader vision about what could be in this nation. And this is during the rise of Jim Crow. And that vision of what could be included schools for everybody. It included removing all of the barriers to the ballot box. It included what a real democracy could be. And the white supremacists were so angry that they slaughtered Black folk. They burned down the Black newspaper. They threatened to kill the editor, and he fled out of town. And then they demanded the resignation of those elected officials, installed themselves in their places, and then had the rest of the government, the feds and the state government, look at this coup government as if it was legitimate. And that there were no consequences for that kind of violence. We then went to Hamburg, South Carolina, where you had a Black militia in 1874 on July 4th, Independence Day, marching down the main street, and a group of whites come up behind them demanding that they part, that they open up and let them through. And the captain was so, he didn't want the kind of violence that these guys were trying to bring. And so he said, okay, let them through. And that wasn't enough, because there was just this anger that there were Black men in uniforms carrying guns. And so the slaughter began, the violence, the unrelenting violence began, including bringing a cannon to kill these Black troops. Then we went to Ocoee, Florida, which I'm going to talk about in my talk. So it's like a great segue, where we also have Americans believing in democracy. And for believing in democracy, they are slaughtered. They are slaughtered. And their property that they had worked so hard for was basically confiscated and sold off for pennies on the dollar. So in this I Too, it's from the Langston Hughes poem, I Too Sing America. And it is in recognition of that I Too that the real patriotism is, where the real democracy is. It is a belief in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual nation, a multi-fabric nation, democracy. That's where our strength is. It's not in this mess that folks are trying to stuff down our throats. And that's why we have to do this heavy lifting. That's why we have to do this work, because it is worth it. American democracy is worth it. So that's the brief form, the summary of I Too.
Wonderful. Shall we go into some thoughts that you have in relation to our honorees and the entrepreneurial work that they're doing?
Yes, and so as a historian, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us some history um, in this struggle for equity. And so first, I want to thank you for inviting me here to speak with you today. I want to thank Judy for her amazing leadership and vision for humanity in action. I want to just honor Claude for doing the really heavy lifting of equity. And just, there's so much work to do that I just want to thank you. I'm going to start with the question that has resonated for centuries in the African-American community is, how do we get free? Just the thought of being free has driven folks to risk everything, to take on enslavers, stare the Ku Klux Klan in the eye, challenge the US government to live up to its creed, and stake a claim in a land where you still must insist Black Lives Matter. Well, I'm going to try to cover 150 years in 15 minutes. So it's going to be more Matterhorn tidbits than Cliff Notes. But I hope the peaks and valleys of this history give some glimmer of why we're here tonight. I will start with the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln pushed for and received legislation that allowed the United States to compensate some slaveholders for their lost property. The largest payout of $18,000 at the time is equal to more than $7 million today. The US government, however, did not compensate 4 million freed Black people for years and years of unpaid labor. And even the promise of economic self-sufficiency, 40 acres and a mule, could not last more than a few months when President Andrew Johnson ordered the US Army to throw the freed people off of the land, the sliver of land that they had been able to get to in Southeast Georgia and South Carolina. And that army then reinstalled the plantation owners. It reminds me of what I call the Billie Holiday School of Economics, them that gets. And that's what we saw happening coming out of the Civil War. In Forsyth County, Georgia, so now we're into the 20th century, just north of Atlanta, a 1912 accusation of rape, a lynching, a kangaroo court, a mass execution was followed by a pogrom and ethnic cleansing. Well, in the midst of this white domestic terrorism was Joseph Kellogg, a man born into slavery who, despite all the odds, had by 1912 amassed 200 acres of farmland, plus property near the town square. Well, the unchecked killing spree in Forsyth County meant that he and his family had to flee and leave hundreds of acres behind, which in today's market is worth more than $10 million. Other African Americans who had managed through the dint of hard labor, thrift, and dreaming about what freedom would look like also lost their small homesteads as whites moved in and staked claim on this blood-soaked land. Forsyth County was so hostile that 70 years later, Oprah, yes, that Oprah Winfrey, who had come to do an interview in that county, was so scared she feared for her very life and couldn't wait to leave. Well, shortly after Forsyth, there would be another pogrom, this time in Florida. In 1920, after the war to make the world safe for democracy, Florida branches of the NAACP and other organizations set out to help realize the democracy that soldiers had fought and died for in World War I. The 19th Amendment had just passed, and the association launched a major voter registration drive aimed at African American women. Ocoee, just a few miles from Orlando, became the testing ground for the theory that Black women were included as beneficiaries of the new constitutional amendment. Well, on election day, despite a recent massive show of force by the Ku Klux Klan, Black people lined up to vote in Ocoee. That act of citizenship was met with widespread violence, intimidation at the polls, an untold number of lynchings, and African Americans' homes, businesses, and churches going up in flames. The white domestic terrorism removed virtually all Black people from the town for the next 50 years, as well as property ownership and businesses. The Historical Society's research estimates that the property that African Americans had to abandon to save their lives is worth around $10 million today. In 1921, there was another thriving African American community, this time in the Greenwood district, known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Doctors, dentists, attorneys, restaurants, shops, barbershops, hair salons, and a movie theater. Thriving entrepreneurship. But a false allegation of rape and a white community jealous of the prosperity of those who had been enslaved less than 60 years earlier led to a full-scale attack on the Greenwood district. 18 hours later, airplanes dropped nitroglycerin bombs, as well as the mob just attacking that community. The violence led to nearly 300 killed and more than $200 million in property in Black Wall Street destroyed. Worse, insurance companies refused to honor the claims of African Americans. In short, in just 18 hours, hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth, of capital, of hard work, of dreams just obliterated. And there would be no compensation, not from the insurance companies who gladly took the premiums but refused to honor the policies, to the local, state, and federal governments who fought reparations well into the 21st century. In short, it wasn't just the reign of terror, but also the impact of public policy, just like with the rescission of 40 acres and a mule. That is key to understanding the canyon between Black and white wealth holding in the United States today. This chasm did not happen because African Americans didn't want to work or have a culture of poverty or didn't know how to save. Indeed, the 60,000 Black people who had deposited $3 million in the Freedmen's Bank after the Civil War and during Reconstruction saw their life savings wiped out in less than 10 years because the board made a series of questionable loans and investments. So saving was not the issue. Trustworthy institutions and responsible governments worthy of the hope and effort that African Americans had invested, that was the issue. Public policy, in short, has been instrumental in fostering Black inequality. One of the New Deal programs established to help with the cataclysm of the Great Depression was the Federal Housing Administration. It was designed to put home ownership within reach of everyday Americans by lowering the requirements for down payments, lengthening the time to pay back the loan, and providing federal insurance for these mortgages to ease the fears of the banks. But there was a big caveat. The FHA's underwriting rules would not provide loans in neighborhoods with sizable Black populations, nor would it approve a loan for somebody who was African American but trying to buy a home in a predominantly white community. The result of this redlining is staggering. Given the role that home ownership plays, African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth today. And this gap is directly linked to redlining, which has robbed Black families of generational wealth. Indeed, the Brookings Institution reports that the loss is equal to about $156 billion. That's with a B, $156 billion. Exacerbating the discrimination in federally sponsored mortgage lending was the GI Bill of 1944. Well, how can that be, you might ask? Especially because the GI Bill, which was transformative for American society, was created to deal with the post-war transition needs of American soldiers following World War II. But there was a poison pill in this federal program. that would provide tuition for education, employment support, and heavily subsidized mortgages. And that poison pill was that this federal program would be administered under local control, which meant it would be in the hands of administrators in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and the rest of the Jim Crow South. So as African-American soldiers returned from Europe and the Pacific, fighting the Nazis, fighting the fascists, the result was to be expected. Under local control, for example, out of more than 3,200 VA mortgage loans approved in Mississippi in 1947, only 2 were approved for Black veterans. The federal government followed closely behind that in 1956 with the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act that created the interstate highway system. It sounds innocuous enough, but the planners used the routing of those miles and miles of concrete to purposely carve straight through Black communities in Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, Syracuse, and more, and foster even greater degree of racial segregation. Using eminent domain, the government paid pennies on the dollar to take over the homes, businesses, properties, and left owners with virtually nothing but a decimated community. But it wasn't just urban areas that felt the sting of targeted discrimination. Black farmers took a major hit by USDA policies that repeatedly denied African Americans loans or granted them under highly unfavorable terms. In 1965, the US Commission on Civil Rights found that the USDA discriminated against Black farmers when providing financial assistance and loans. More than 30 years later, the Clinton administration admitted as much. The resulting $1 billion settlement should have helped, but few Black farmers were able to access it, and tens of thousands had their claims denied. Then, in 2021, President Biden signed a bill with a provision granting a $4 billion loan forgiveness program for Black farmers as compensation for a century of discrimination. Shortly thereafter, a judge issued an injunction blocking those payments because white farmers with no sense of irony or shame sued, saying the program discriminated against them. What I hope this brief history lays out is how the wealth gap, the equity gap that we are experiencing was no accident. As Maryland Governor Wes Moore noted in a recent speech, the only way you make things more equitable is you have to be intentional. You don't accidentally get to equitable, because we didn't accidentally get to inequitable. It was intentional. So I return to my initial question. How do we get free? The answer, intentional equity, intentional justice. Thank you.